The shelter worker heard the faint cries at first, soft and pitiful, like the sound of a child's whimper. She dismissed it quickly, the noise fading into the background of her busy routine. There was always something to do in a shelter: feed the animals, clean the cages, check the supplies. The constant hum of movement around her made it easy to ignore the small, unimportant sounds. But today, something felt different. It had been a long shift, hours of the same work, and she was starting to feel the weight of exhaustion. She moved past the rows of kennels, wiping down the bars and trying to ignore the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She wasn't in the mood for sympathy today. She had seen it all: the neglected, the abandoned, the sick, and she was used to it. The shelter was not a place for idealism or romance. It was a place where animals came to be forgotten. The cry came again. Louder this time. Desperate. It cut through the air, piercing the routine of the shelter like a needle. The worker stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. She knew that sound: something was wrong. But as quickly as it came, she shook her head and pushed it aside. There were hundreds of dogs in the shelter, all with their own issues. One more cry didn't mean anything. She glanced at the clock. Time was slipping away, and the last thing she wanted was to deal with another animal's drama. She had 1,000 things to do, and a dog crying in the corner was not on her list. Minutes passed, and the cry grew even louder. It echoed down the hall like a child in distress. She frowned. There was something in the cry now, a deep, raw anguish. The worker's instincts prickled at the edges of her mind. She paused again, her gaze shifting toward the back of the shelter. The sound was coming from the farthest kennel, the one tucked away in a quiet corner where no one ever went. Her fingers gripped the mop tightly. She told herself it was just another dog trying to get attention. They did that sometimes, especially the new ones, trying to figure out who would care enough to notice them. She had seen it all before. But today, something about it felt different. Something about the desperation in the cry tugged at something deeper. It wasn't normal. It wasn't just whining. It was a plea. A call for help. Against her better judgment, the worker set the mop down and walked toward the back of the shelter. Each step was reluctant, her feet dragging against the cold concrete floor. The kennel was small, tucked away behind a row of larger cages. It was the last one on the left, the one no one ever bothered to clean thoroughly, where the animals were left alone, isolated. As she approached, the crying grew louder, more frantic. The dog was in the corner, curled up into a tight ball, its body shaking. Its face was hidden behind its paws, but the worker could see the tremors that ran through its tiny frame. It was a small, scruffy dog. S fur matted with dirt and grime. She bent down, reaching for the bars of the cage. The dog didn't look up at her. Instead, it whined softly, its body jerking with each cry. She hesitated. What was going on with this dog? It wasn't like the others. It didn't even look like it belonged in the shelter. It was too small, too fragile, its ribs showing beneath its dirty coat. "Hey there, little one," the worker murmured, her voice soft but stern. "What's the matter with you?" The dog whimpered again, its eyes slowly lifting to meet hers. For the first time, the worker saw it: something was wrong. The eyes were clouded, the pupils dilated in a way that made her stomach tighten. And then, in the dim light of the corner, she saw something that made her freeze. The dog's side was swollen, an unnatural bulge pressing against the skin. The swelling was so severe, it looked like it was about to burst. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen injuries before: broken bones, cuts, infections, but this was different. This wasn't just an injury. This wasn't something a dog could survive alone. Without thinking, the worker rushed to the front desk, grabbing the phone and dialing the number for the local vet. "We need someone here, now," she said, her voice shaking with urgency. "We have an emergency." An hour later. The vet arrived with a sense of urgency, his face tight as he hurried through the shelter's front doors. He had been called in for plenty of emergencies before, but this one felt different. The worker led him to the back of the shelter, where the dog was still curled up in the same spot. The vet knelt beside the cage, his eyes scanning the dog's body with professional precision. He placed his hand gently on the dog's swollen side. "That doesn't look good," he muttered, more to himself than to the worker. The vet motioned for the worker to unlock the cage. He needed to get a closer look, but there was something about the way he moved that made the worker uneasy. His face had gone pale. As he carefully lifted the dog, the swelling shifted, revealing something horrifying. The worker gasped, her heart racing in her chest. The swelling wasn't just from an injury. It was something inside the dog. Something that shouldn't be there. The vet's eyes widened. He held the dog still, his hands trembling as he carefully pulled back the matted fur. The worker watched in shock as the vet's fingers brushed against something hard beneath the skin. It was then that he gasped. "Good God," the vet whispered, stepping back. The worker blinked, her mind racing. "What is it? What's wrong with him?" The vet didn't answer at first. He just stared at the dog in disbelief. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke in a low, hoarse voice. "This dog has something inside it. Something foreign. It's not a normal injury." The worker didn't understand. "Foreign?" she repeated, her voice trembling. The vet didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached for his bag and pulled out a syringe. "We need to sedate the dog," he said. "We need to get it to a clinic. I'll explain everything there." The drive to the clinic. As the vet drove with the dog in the back seat, the worker couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. What had she just seen? What had the vet seen? The dog's cries were now quiet, replaced by the soft hum of the car's engine. But the silence was almost worse. It felt like a heavy weight, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She glanced at the vet, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He hadn't said much since the discovery, his face pale and tight. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did you see?" The vet didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. Instead, his grip tightened on the steering wheel. The worker's mind raced. What could be inside the dog? What had made the vet react like that? Was it something that could change everything? Was the dog, was it a sign? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp turn, and she looked out the window, her stomach twisting in anticipation of whatever was waiting at the clinic. But no matter what happened next, one thing was certain. This story wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. As the vet slammed on the brakes outside the clinic, he turned to the worker, his face pale and strained. "We're not prepared for this," he said quietly. "We need to call in someone else." The clinic's sterile white walls were a far cry from the dim and dusty shelter. The scent of antiseptic was thick in the air, and the buzz of fluorescent lights filled the room with an unnerving hum. The vet, Dr. Thomas, quickly ushered the worker into the examination room, his face set in grim lines. He didn't say much, but the way his hands shook as he set the dog down on the examination table told the worker everything she needed to know. Something was terribly wrong. The worker stood by the door, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. She tried to steady her breathing, but the unease gnawing at her stomach wouldn't go away. The discovery from earlier still lingered in her mind like a shadow, something that refused to let go. Dr. Thomas had been quiet ever since they arrived, almost too quiet. He hadn't explained what he'd seen, hadn't said why it was so urgent to bring the dog here. He just called for help, but it was clear that even he didn't know what he was dealing with. The dog, still sedated, lay motionless on the table. Its fur had been shaved back, revealing the swollen mass beneath the skin, an unnatural bulge that looked wrong in every way. The vet's hands trembled as he examined the dog, his fingers tracing the outline of the swelling as if he were afraid to touch it too hard. "We need to run some tests," Dr. Thomas muttered to himself, his voice distant. The worker shifted her weight from foot to foot, her mind racing. "What did you see earlier?" she asked, her voice tight. "What's going on with this dog?" Dr. Thomas didn't immediately respond. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes scanning the dog with a mixture of disbelief and something darker, fear. Finally, he looked up, meeting her eyes. "It's not a normal injury," he said, his voice low. "It's something foreign inside it. Something that doesn't belong." The worker swallowed hard. "What do you mean, something that doesn't belong? What are we talking about here?" Dr. Thomas sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to collect his thoughts. "I don't know yet. But it's not natural. I've never seen anything like it." The worker's heart pounded in her chest. The fear that had been gnawing at her since she first found the dog was now a solid weight in the pit of her stomach. She tried to push back the panic rising inside her, but it was impossible. Whatever was happening to this dog wasn't just an injury, it was something far more dangerous, something she wasn't prepared for. Dr. Thomas turned away from the table and began pulling instruments from a nearby cabinet, his movements quick and decisive. He worked in silence, but the worker could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands shook as he set up the equipment. It was clear that whatever was going on, it was beyond his expertise. "Shouldn't we call someone else?" the worker asked, her voice trembling. "You said we need to call in someone else. Who?" Dr. Thomas paused, glancing at her before returning his focus to the dog. "There's no time. We need to act quickly, or this could get worse." The worker's mind raced, but before she could ask another question, the vet moved swiftly, preparing to conduct more tests. She stepped back, watching him as he worked with a professional detachment, even though she could see the strain in his eyes. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the vet worked tirelessly, running tests and analyzing the results. The silence in the room was unbearable, broken only by the soft beeping of the machines and the occasional sound of the vet muttering to himself. Finally, he stepped back from the table, his face pale and drawn. He didn't meet the worker's eyes, and the worker could see the weight of something heavy hanging between them. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Thomas swallowed, his gaze flickering to the dog. "I was right. There's something inside this dog. Something I can't explain." He looked at the worker, his expression serious. "But it's not just inside the dog, it's growing. Whatever it is, it's alive." The worker's stomach churned. "What do you mean, alive?" "I don't know yet," Dr. Thomas said. "But I'm going to have to call in some specialists. This is beyond me. Beyond what any vet should have to deal with." The worker's mind spun. Whatever was inside the dog, whatever had caused that unnatural swelling, it wasn't just an injury. It was something far more sinister, and no one seemed to know what it was. The vet picked up the phone and dialed a number quickly. His voice was calm, but the worker could hear the underlying tension. "Yes, Dr. Thomas here. I need to consult with the team. We have an emergency. I've got a case here I can't explain, no, not like anything I've seen before. Yes, it's serious. I'll send the details over. We need help immediately." As he hung up the phone, the worker's heart raced. "What's happening? Who are you calling?" "Someone who might know more about this," Dr. Thomas said grimly. "I need a second opinion. A real one. We're in over our heads." The worker's pulse quickened. "What exactly are we dealing with here, Dr. Thomas? What's inside this dog?" "I can't say yet. I need more tests," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But whatever it is, it's not natural. It's not something we should be seeing. Dr. Thomas's words hung in the air, the implication sinking in like a heavy weight. The worker felt a chill creep up her spine. The dog wasn't just suffering from an injury, it was carrying something alive, and whatever it was had the potential to change everything. The door to the clinic opened suddenly, and a man stepped in, his dark eyes scanning the room before landing on the dog. His appearance was striking, tall, with short-cropped hair and a no-nonsense expression. He moved quickly to the table, his eyes sharp as he examined the dog with a practiced eye. "Dr. Thomas," the man said in a low voice, "I heard the call. What's going on?" The vet looked up, a mix of relief and exhaustion crossing his face. "We've got a situation here, Greg. I need you to take a look at this. We're dealing with something, well, something out of the ordinary." Greg nodded and stepped closer to the table. His gaze fell on the swollen mass beneath the dog's fur, and the color drained from his face. "Jesus," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is bad." "What is it?" the worker demanded, her voice tight. "What's inside the dog?" Greg didn't answer immediately. He just leaned over, examining the dog closely. The silence in the room grew thick, and the worker could feel the tension in the air as they both worked to understand what they were looking at. Finally, Greg straightened up, his eyes locked on Dr. Thomas. This is a parasite," he said quietly. The worker's breath caught in her throat. "A parasite? What kind of parasite?" Greg hesitated, glancing at the dog. "It's not like anything I've seen before. But it's definitely a parasite. And it's spreading." Dr. Thomas nodded, his face grim. "Exactly what I feared." The worker's mind raced, trying to process the words. "What does that mean? Is it going to kill the dog?" "I don't know," Greg replied, his voice low and tense. "But whatever it is, it's not just an infection. It's alive, and it's feeding off the dog. We need to remove it, and we need to do it fast. Before it spreads even further." The worker's stomach churned. How did it get inside the dog? How did this happen? Dr. Thomas and Greg exchanged a look, their faces filled with a mixture of disbelief and something else, something darker. "We don't know yet," Dr. Thomas said quietly. "But whatever it is, it's not normal. And it's going to take everything we have to figure out how to stop it." As the two vets prepared to perform an emergency procedure, the worker felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. The reality of the situation began to sink in. The dog wasn't just in danger, it was carrying something terrifying, something that could change everything. But there was more. Something even darker was lurking beneath the surface. Whatever had caused this parasite to enter the dog, whatever was feeding off it, was only just the beginning. And the worker had no idea how much deeper this mystery would go. The clinic felt like a pressure cooker. The sterile walls seemed to close in on the worker as she stood at the edge of the examination room, her heart hammering in her chest. The air was thick with tension, and even the quiet hum of the machines felt louder than usual. Dr. Thomas and Greg were huddled around the table, preparing for the procedure that would hopefully save the dog's life. Yet, even as they worked, a sense of dread gnawed at the worker. What they had already uncovered about the parasite was chilling, but something told her that the worst was still to come. The worker's gaze shifted back to the dog, still lying motionless on the examination table. Its fur had been shaved back to reveal the infected area, but now that she looked closer, something didn't feel right. The swelling seemed to move, pulsing in a way that made her skin crawl. It wasn't just the swelling of an injury, there was something much more sinister at play here. The vet, Dr. Thomas, had explained earlier that the parasite was feeding off the dog, but what did that really mean? The dog wasn't simply infected, it was being consumed from the inside out. The idea of something feeding off the dog's body made the worker's stomach turn. But what was even worse was the fact that they couldn't identify the parasite. They didn't know where it had come from or how it had gotten inside. Greg, the second vet, was still scanning the dog with a focused intensity, his face hard with concentration. "We need to sedate the dog further," he said, his voice low but decisive. "It's going to be a tricky operation. The parasite's embedded too deeply." Dr. Thomas nodded, moving to prepare the necessary equipment. The worker could see the worry in their eyes, despite their professional demeanor. They were both experts, but even they were unsure of what was happening. That uncertainty made the worker uneasy. "What do we do now?" she asked. Her voice tight. "How do we stop it from spreading?" Greg looked up at her, his face pale. "The parasite is feeding off the dog's body, but it's also growing. If we don't get it out now, it'll continue to spread. But we can't just extract it like a typical foreign object. It's too integrated with the dog's tissues." The worker felt her breath catch in her throat. How did this happen? How could something like this grow inside it? "I wish I knew," Dr. Thomas muttered, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared the syringe. "But whatever this parasite is, it's not like anything we've seen before. And we're not just talking about a biological anomaly. There's something else, something deeper." The worker's mind was reeling. What did they mean, something deeper? She had only just begun to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a parasite. It wasn't just a random infection. There was a purpose behind it. There had to be. As Dr. Thomas administered the sedative to the dog, Greg turned to the worker. "Listen," he said quietly, "I know this is hard to understand. But we've dealt with parasites before. Some of them are rare, sure, but this is different. I've seen parasites that affect the nervous system, others that latch onto internal organs. But this one seems to be attacking the dog's very life force." The worker swallowed hard. "You mean, it's feeding on the dog's soul?" The words felt strange, even absurd, but in her gut, she knew this was more than just biology. There was something unnatural about the way the dog's body had responded to the parasite. Greg shook his head slowly. "No, not exactly. But it's more than just a physical attack. The dog's body is fighting back in ways we don't understand. It's rejecting the parasite, but at the same time, the parasite is adapting, evolving. That's what makes it dangerous. It's like a war between the dog's body and this thing inside it." The worker's eyes widened. "It's adapting? How?" "We don't know yet," Dr. Thomas said, his voice strained as he prepared to make the incision. "But that's what we're going to find out." The worker stepped closer to the table, her mind swirling with confusion and fear. She had always worked at the shelter out of a deep love for animals. She'd rescued dozens of dogs, cats, and other creatures, always doing her best to provide them with a safe, caring environment. But this? This was unlike anything she had ever encountered. Dr. Thomas made the first incision, and the worker could feel the tension in the room increase. The dog's body seemed to twitch at the touch of the scalpel, as though it were alive with its own response. The incision was slow and careful, but the worker's eyes never left the mass beneath the skin. She could see it now, pulsing and shifting, almost as though it were trying to crawl deeper inside the dog. Greg leaned in closer, his face pale. "I don't like this," he muttered under his breath. "I've seen tumors, infections, even parasitic infestations. But this is something else." The worker watched as Dr. Thomas continued to cut, his hands steady despite the growing tension in the room. The dog was completely sedated, but it didn't seem to be at peace. There was a subtle, unnatural resistance to the procedure. It was as if the dog itself was still struggling against the invasion inside it. As the incision deepened, the worker noticed something she hadn't seen before. There, beneath the surface of the dog's flesh, a faint glow emanated from the wound. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but as Dr. Thomas continued his work, the glow grew stronger. It was a pale blue light, unlike anything the worker had ever seen in a living creature. "What is that?" she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Thomas stopped, his hands frozen mid-cut. He turned to Greg, his face etched with disbelief. "What the hell is that?" Greg's eyes were wide. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it." The glow intensified, filling the room with an eerie, almost otherworldly light. The worker took a step back, her heart pounding. The air around them seemed to thrum with an unnatural energy, as though something invisible was vibrating in the space between them. "We need to stop," Dr. Thomas said urgently, stepping back from the table. "Something's wrong. This is no longer just a medical issue. We're dealing with something that isn't just a parasite. We're dealing with something alien." The worker's breath caught in her throat. Alien? Was that even possible? But as she watched the glow intensify, she couldn't deny that something about this situation was far beyond what she had ever imagined. Greg's voice broke the silence. "We need to figure out what we're dealing with, fast. I don't think this is just a biological problem. There's something more at play here, something we're not prepared for." The worker's mind was racing. She wanted to run, to escape from the feeling that was creeping over her, but she couldn't. Not yet. She had to know what was happening. She had to understand. "What are we supposed to do?" she asked, her voice shaking. "How do we fix this?" Dr. Thomas looked at her, his face pale and drawn. "We need to find out where this parasite came from. How it got inside this dog. And if we're lucky, we might just figure out a way to stop it before it spreads further." But as the glow continued to pulse from the dog's wound, the worker couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer in control. The parasite wasn't just alive, it was something far more dangerous. And if they didn't act quickly, they might not just lose the dog. They could lose something far more valuable. Something they had yet to realize they were already fighting for. The dog let out a low, mournful whine. And the pulse of light from its wound grew brighter, more frantic. The room felt colder, the air heavier. The worker's chest tightened as she realized, this wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about something much bigger, and much darker. They had no idea what they were truly up against. The air inside the clinic was suffocating. The fluorescent lights above flickered sporadically, casting an unsettling glow over the sterile environment. The hum of machinery was the only sound, but it felt like a deafening silence. The worker could barely keep her composure as she stood frozen by the examination table, her mind reeling with the events unfolding around her. Dr. Thomas and Greg had stopped their work entirely, their attention completely fixed on the bizarre, otherworldly glow emanating from the wound on the dog's body. The dog's fur was now completely shaved, revealing a horrific sight, deep, raw flesh, with the parasite embedded in it. The glow had turned into a pulsating light, almost rhythmic in its intensity. It felt wrong. The worker's stomach churned as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Nothing made sense. This wasn't just an infection, it was something entirely different, something that seemed to transcend biology altogether. Dr. Thomas took a step back from the table, his hands trembling as he wiped his brow. He was a seasoned vet, experienced with countless surgeries and medical crises, but this was something he had never encountered before. "We need to figure out what's going on," he said, his voice strained. "Something's not right. This thing, inside the dog, it's not just a parasite. It's more like a foreign organism, a life form that's adapting and changing in ways we can't understand." Greg was pacing near the door, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "I don't know what it is, but it's not normal. There's something here that's beyond anything we've encountered in all our years of practice." The worker could feel the tension rising in the room. Something had shifted. She had seen the look in Dr. Thomas's eyes, the look of someone who knew they were in over their heads. "Do you think it's from outer space?" the worker asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. She hadn't meant to speak the words aloud, but they slipped out in a moment of panic. Dr. Thomas looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he muttered. "But I wouldn't rule it out. Whatever this thing is, it's unlike anything we've seen before. And I have a feeling we're not just dealing with a medical problem here. This feels purposeful." Greg stopped pacing and turned toward Dr. Thomas. "Purposeful? What are you trying to say?" Dr. Thomas looked at the dog, his gaze intense. "I'm saying that this parasite, this organism, isn't just affecting the dog physically. It's affecting its entire biological system. It's almost like it's hijacking its body, taking control from the inside out." The worker felt a chill run down her spine. She had been thinking the same thing but hadn't dared to voice it. The parasite was no longer just a foreign body. It was something much more insidious. But what was its purpose? And why had it chosen this particular dog? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft, unsettling sound. The dog, still sedated, let out a low whine. It wasn't a cry of pain, but something more akin to a plea for help. The worker's heart clenched in her chest. The dog had been through so much already, and now it was fighting something far bigger than itself. Dr. Thomas gave the dog a concerned glance. "It's still conscious," he murmured. "The sedative should have put it out, but it's fighting it. Whatever's inside it, it's causing the dog's body to resist the drugs. That's not normal." The worker took a step closer to the table, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out a trembling hand, brushing the dog's fur gently. "Poor thing," she whispered. "What's happening to you?" Greg turned sharply, his eyes wide with realization. "Wait a second. You're right. The dog shouldn't be able to resist the sedative like that. Its body is reacting as if it's trying to stay awake, to be aware of what's going on." Dr. Thomas nodded slowly. "That's exactly it. Whatever's inside the dog is making it more than just a victim. It's turning it into something else, something that's aware, alive in ways we don't understand." The worker could feel her heart racing. What did this mean? The dog wasn't just a helpless creature anymore, it was fighting for its life in a way no one had anticipated. But why? And how? Greg's voice cut through the tension. "We need to take samples. Blood, tissue, anything we can get. I have to know what this thing is. We can't just keep guessing." Dr. Thomas nodded, his face grim. "Right. But we need to be careful. If this parasite can resist sedatives and attack the dog's biology in this way, it might be able to affect us, too. We're dealing with something far more dangerous than we thought." The worker stepped back, unease creeping over her like a shadow. She had never felt so helpless in her life. They were doctors, they were experts, and yet none of them had any answers. The dog was still breathing heavily, its body twitching slightly, as if the parasite was trying to force its way out. The moment felt surreal, like they were standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. And as much as she hated to admit it, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as though something outside the clinic, something unseen, was observing them, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Do you think anyone else knows about this?" the worker asked quietly, her voice trembling. "About what's really happening here?" Greg shook his head, his face pale. "No. And we can't tell anyone yet. If we alert the authorities, it'll spread like wildfire. People will panic. No one's ready for this." Dr. Thomas looked up sharply. "We need to find out where this thing came from. We need to stop it before it spreads further." The worker nodded slowly, her mind racing. She wasn't sure if she was ready to uncover the truth, but she knew they had no choice. They were in too deep now. Whatever this parasite was, it was changing everything. She looked at the dog again, her heart heavy. The poor creature had been through so much already. What else could it possibly endure? Dr. Thomas turned back to the dog, his expression determined. I'm going to get some more tools. Greg, keep an eye on the samples. We need to understand what's happening here. As they prepared to continue their work, the worker couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer alone in the clinic. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thick with an unspoken danger. Whatever they were dealing with, it was far more dangerous than any of them could have anticipated. And then, just as they were about to begin again, the power went out. The lights flickered and died, plunging the clinic into total darkness. The only sound was the soft, panicked breathing of the dog. The worker froze. Was it the storm outside? Or was something else at play? Her heart raced as she tried to adjust to the sudden, oppressive blackness. And then, from the shadows, she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. A rustle, followed by a faint clicking noise. It was coming from the table. Her breath hitched in her throat. Was the parasite moving? In the pitch black, she couldn't see what was happening. But she could hear it. And that sound, the unnatural, clicking, scuttling noise, sent a chill down her spine. Dr. Thomas, she whispered, her voice shaky. Greg? What's going on? But there was no answer. Suddenly, the dog let out a loud, terrified yelp, and the worker's heart nearly stopped. Whatever was happening, it was getting worse. The parasite had awoken again, and this time, it seemed to be in control. And that was when the worker realized, something far more dangerous than the dog's suffering had just been unleashed. The worker's heartbeat thundered in her ears as the dog let out another desperate, agonized cry. The clicking grew louder, closer, as though something was crawling out of the darkness. What was happening to the dog, and what was lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike? The mystery deepened. The power was out. The fluorescent lights had flickered one last time before they gave up, leaving the clinic in total darkness. The worker felt the air around her tighten, as though it had grown heavier, suffocating. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, drowning out everything else. The only sound in the room was the faint rustling, the scuttling noise that seemed to be coming from the dog's body. The dog's whimpers grew louder, more frantic. The poor creature was in pain, its body trembling violently as if some unseen force had taken hold of it. And then, there it was again, the noise. A dry, clicking sound, almost mechanical in nature. The worker's breath caught in her throat. Whatever was happening wasn't natural. She reached out blindly, her hand groping for anything she could hold on to. The dark was complete now, her vision useless. She had no choice but to rely on her hearing, and that rustling, that clicking noise, was growing closer. Dr. Thomas, she called out, her voice trembling. Greg? Can you hear me? But no answer came. Only the soft, agonized yelps of the dog. The fear was palpable, hanging thick in the air. The worker could feel her legs shake as she stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. Suddenly, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate. Not the hurried, panicked steps of someone trying to escape danger, but rather the calm, purposeful steps of someone, or something, coming closer. Her heart raced. Who else could be here? They hadn't heard anyone enter the clinic. The worker took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and fumbled for her phone. The screen lit up briefly as she unlocked it, casting a faint glow around her. She quickly turned on the flashlight and aimed it in the direction of the examination table. The light bounced off the stainless steel surfaces, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and shift in the darkness. But the most chilling thing was the shape she saw moving on the table. The dog was still there, its body writhing, but it wasn't alone. There, emerging from the wound in the dog's side, was a strange, wriggling mass. The parasite, if it could even be called that anymore, was no longer just attached to the dog's flesh. It had grown, almost doubling in size. It was twisting and contorting, as if it were alive in a way that defied nature. The clicking sound was louder now, coming from the mass itself, as though it were some kind of mechanical creature rather than a biological one. The worker's stomach turned as she realized the truth. Whatever this thing was, it was no longer just a parasite. It had become something else entirely. The mass moved again, this time more violently, and the dog let out a screech of pure terror. The sound of its cries pierced the silence, sending a shiver down the worker's spine. She couldn't just stand there. She had to help the dog. She had to stop whatever was happening. Without thinking, she rushed forward, shining the flashlight directly on the wriggling mass. The light illuminated its grotesque, twisting form. It was a combination of organic and metallic parts, its surface shifting between organic tissue and hard, mechanical segments. It was like nothing she had ever seen. The dog let out another blood-curdling scream, its body seizing. The mass seemed to respond, pulsating with a strange energy as if it were feeding off the dog's fear and pain. It was as though the dog's suffering was the very thing that powered it. "Dr. Thomas," she shouted again, but the clinic remained eerily silent. She felt the panic rising inside her, threatening to overtake her. What was she supposed to do? She couldn't fight this thing, whatever it was. It was beyond anything she had ever encountered. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was something otherworldly. Suddenly, a low, guttural voice broke through the silence. "Step away from the dog." The worker froze. The voice was deep, chilling, and it sent a wave of dread crashing over her. She turned her head toward the source of the sound, but there was no one there. She swung the flashlight around, her hands trembling. The beam of light flickered across the room, revealing only shadows and empty spaces. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky with fear. "Show yourself." But the voice spoke again, and this time, the words were colder, more commanding. "Step away from the dog. It's too late to help it." The worker's pulse quickened. She couldn't understand. Who was this voice? And what did it mean, "It's too late to help"? There was no time to think. The situation was deteriorating fast. The dog was still writhing on the table, its body now contorting in ways that seemed physically impossible. The parasite was no longer a part of it, it had become the dog. It was consuming it, absorbing its life force, and the dog's body seemed to be transforming before her eyes. She stepped back, her mind racing. She needed to figure out what was going on. She needed to find Dr. Thomas and Greg. They had to have answers. Suddenly, the clinic door creaked open, and the worker jumped, spinning toward the sound. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, framed by the dim light from the hallway. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face obscured by shadows. "Who are you?" the worker demanded, her voice shaking. "What's happening to the dog?" The man stepped forward, the faint light catching his face. His expression was grim, his eyes cold and calculating. "It's already too late," he said again, his voice low and emotionless. "The dog is lost. And so are you, if you don't leave now." The worker recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean? What are you talking about? What is happening here?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he took another step forward, and the worker instinctively stepped back. The sense of danger was overwhelming, and her instinct screamed at her to get out of the clinic before it was too late. "Don't you understand?" the man said, his voice softening just slightly. "This is bigger than you. Than any of us. You've stumbled onto something you're not meant to understand." The worker was frozen. She wanted to run, to flee from whatever this man was, but something kept her rooted to the spot. He knew something she didn't, and the fear in his eyes made her realize that whatever was happening in the clinic was far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. And then, as if on cue, the power flickered back on. The lights buzzed to life, flooding the room with harsh, sterile light. The worker's heart skipped a beat as she looked back at the table. The dog was gone. The parasite, too, had vanished. The examination table was empty. But something else had taken its place. On the surface of the table, a dark, viscous substance glistened under the light. It was slowly spreading, like a stain that refused to fade. The worker took a cautious step forward, her breath catching in her throat. What was this? What had happened to the dog? And why did she feel like she was standing at the edge of something far, far worse? The man watched her silently, his face unreadable. "You should leave," he said again, his tone colder now. "Before it's too late for you." The worker wanted to protest, to demand answers, but a sinking feeling in her stomach told her that he was right. There was something she didn't know, something she wasn't supposed to know. And if she didn't leave, she might never get the chance to find out. The worker hesitated, torn between the fear of what was happening and the need to understand the truth. What had just happened to the dog? Where had it gone? And what was the dark substance that now covered the table? The man's warning echoed in her mind, "Before it's too late for you." Would she find out the truth, or was it already too late? The worker stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The sterile light overhead buzzed like a warning, filling the space with an unsettling hum. Her eyes were glued to the dark substance slowly spreading across the table, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The dog, gone. The parasite, vanished. And yet, the room was no less sinister. The man who had appeared from nowhere still watched her with his cold, unwavering eyes, his face unreadable. It was as if the very air in the clinic had thickened, pressing down on her, smothering her with the weight of the unknown. The tension in the room was palpable. She could feel it crawling up her spine, settling deep in her gut, urging her to run, to escape, to leave everything behind before whatever dark force was at work consumed her too. But something kept her rooted to the spot. "What's happening here?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Where is the dog? What is that on the table?" The man took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the table, and his lips twitched in what could almost have been a grim smile. "You're asking the wrong questions," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You need to ask yourself how much you really want to know." Her pulse raced. "What does that mean? What's going on?" The man's eyes flickered briefly, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted. A fleeting hint of doubt, or maybe something darker. He looked back at the table, as if weighing his next words carefully. "You've seen it now. You've seen the remnants of the process. The parasite was only the beginning." The worker's breath caught. The beginning of what? He stepped even closer, his figure looming over her, casting a long shadow across the table. "Of the transformation. What you witnessed wasn't just an infection. It was a link. A bridge. A beginning of something far more complicated." "Complicated?" Her voice rose with a mix of confusion and fear. "What are you talking about? Who are you? What was that thing? Where's Dr. Thomas? Why didn't he stop it?" The man's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Dr. Thomas is irrelevant now." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The worker's mind spun, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of truth. "What do you mean irrelevant?" The man reached out, his hand hovering just above the dark substance on the table. He didn't touch it, but the way he looked at it, the reverence in his gaze, chilled her to her core. "What you're looking at isn't just some parasite. It's a force, a manifestation of something much older, much more dangerous. It doesn't just infect. It transforms. It changes everything it touches. She took a step back, her breath shallow. Changes? How? What does it do? The man's gaze flickered back to her, and there was a coldness in his eyes that made her skin crawl. It takes what it needs and leaves nothing behind. Dr. Thomas was the first to truly understand its potential. And now it's too late for anyone to stop it. Too late. Her voice wavered, panic creeping in. Stop it? What's going to happen to me? To all of us? The man took a slow, deliberate breath, his expression unreadable. It's already happening. The process has begun. And there's no turning back. The worker's heart stopped. She felt the room spinning, the walls closing in on her. Her legs felt weak, as if they might give way at any moment. What process? What do you mean? He stepped back, his eyes never leaving her. The parasite you saw, the creature inside that dog, isn't the only one. It's a part of a much larger plan. A plan that has been in motion for decades. It's an experiment, one that has crossed species and boundaries you can't even begin to imagine. And you, my dear, are now a part of it. The words hit her like a slap. Her mind raced to understand what he was saying. What are you saying? That thing, it's inside me now? His silence was answer enough. The worker's legs buckled, and she grabbed onto the table for support, her body trembling. Her pulse hammered in her temples, and for a moment, she thought she might pass out. No, she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. This isn't real. It can't be. It is, the man said quietly. And it's only the beginning. You've been exposed to it, just like the others. The dog wasn't the first. It was just the beginning of a much larger wave. She felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. The weight of his words crashed over her, suffocating her. I don't understand. Why? Why are you telling me this? The man's expression softened, just slightly, as if he almost felt pity for her. Because you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to understand what's happening to you. The worker's mind reeled. She had seen something monstrous. Something that shouldn't exist. But this man, this stranger, was telling her it wasn't over. It was only starting. How do you know all of this? She asked, her voice cracking with the strain of disbelief. Who are you? He sighed, a deep, almost weary sound. I've been watching this happen for years. My job isn't to stop it. It's to make sure it unfolds exactly as it was planned. Planned? The word felt like a punch to the gut. Who planned this? The man's eyes darkened. The ones who have been pulling the strings from the beginning. The ones who created the parasite. The ones who are now waiting for it to reach its full potential. Waiting? The worker barely managed to speak through her terror. Waiting for what? The man met her gaze. For the next phase. The transformation. The one that will change everything. The worker stumbled back, her mind spinning. She had seen the signs. She had seen the dog. She had seen the transformation taking place. But now she realized the full scope of what was happening. She wasn't just a witness to it. She was part of it. A wave of nausea rolled over her, and she fought to keep her composure. She couldn't let this man see her crumble. What happens now? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The man looked at her for a long moment, his eyes calculating. Now, you run. You get out of here. Before it's too late for you. Her breath caught in her throat. Too late for me? Yes, he said, his voice low and final. The parasite has already started to merge with your system. You can't fight it. You can't escape it. The worker took a step back, the room spinning faster now, the walls closing in. The world felt like it was slipping from beneath her. She didn't understand what was happening. She couldn't comprehend how her life had taken such a dark turn. But she knew one thing for sure. It was far from over. The worker stood, paralyzed with fear. Her mind raced as the man's words echoed in her ears. It's too late for you. Those words burned into her memory, and a sense of doom swept over her. The parasite had already started its transformation inside her. What would happen next? Would she even survive long enough to understand what was going on? Was she doomed to become just another part of the experiment? The man turned and walked toward the door, leaving her standing alone in the darkened clinic. Would she fight back? Or would she be consumed by the darkness that had already claimed so many others before her?